morning, everybody. How are we doing today? It's a rather warm Monday morning here in the American Midwest, but it's June, so that's what you get. Thank goodness we have a pool in the backyard for me to lay on and get my cool on. Us Arctic beasts like a nice place to lay and catch some sun sometimes. Today we're going to talk about Verve Part 2, the 60s. And those of you who haven't watched Part 1, you should probably watch that first and just see the royalty that Norman Granz documents in the 50s. Clef goes back to 46. I think Norman Granz was like 53. And then he kind of absorbs that stuff into Verve, which he launches in 56. And as well as the stuff he licensed to Mercury, it's all repackaged in Verve, as well as some new recordings. And it's really a who's who. If you took a Jazz Hall of Fame in 1955, the percentage of those guys that would be at Verve is pretty high. It's really crazy how many of the legends, from Parker to Gillespie to Fitzgerald to Billie Holiday to Count Basie to all the Ellington sidemen, it's just an incredible assimilation of the best talent of the golden era of jazz as they reach their golden years, recording the blues and that gospel of jazz in a very honest vernacular, in a very supportive structure and framework. It's partly why it feels loose and free and joyous, was the supportive understructure that existed when you worked under Norman Granz. He was a very big promoter of the music, promoter of the black expression, and wanted to preserve and document that. And so these guys were treated very well, and he fought for them. And he was a character at times, from what I understand. But Norman Granz is someone that we all should really hold in higher reverence than we do. That being said, money, this and that. He was actually talking to Sinatra about bringing Sinatra in. Those talks kind of broke down over money. And one thing led to another. Sinatra starts Reprise with a guy by the name of Bossa, something like that, who went from Verve to Reprise. And Norman Granz ends up selling his label in 1961 to MGM. Now, MGM is a giant film company on the West Coast. They have launched several music labels. Much of it was intended to put out their film soundtracks. But on the MGM imprint, there is some jazz stuff in the 50s. They launched a little subsidiary label called Metro Jazz, which I've talked about some lately. And that Metro Jazz that MGM launches in like 56 or 7 has about 15 titles that are all really high quality jazz titles from the West Coast, with some of the great players, a great Gigi Grice record, a Sonny Rollins record. Some of the stuff will end up on Verve later, after MGM absorbs Verve into their catalog. They don't run the Metro Jazz thing very long. But when MGM buys Verve, now they suddenly have this huge body of jazz that they can work with and manipulate as they see fit. They hire Creed Taylor. And those of you who follow my channel know that Creed Taylor is another very important figure in the structure and the body of jazz. He's not a player. He's not from the ghetto. He doesn't know black America. But he worked at Bethlehem, which is a very white label, and helped produce some great sessions there, even for brothers like Johnny Hartman. He might have been on the Dexter Gordon record at Bethlehem as well. He's there for a lot of the 10-inch stuff. He ends up going to ABC in like 57. Stays there for a couple of years. Convinces ABC to launch Impulse. And Creed Taylor was a large factor in the Impulse label being created by ABC. But then after he launches Impulse, his restless nature, the unbridled content of the John Coltrane body of work, Creed Taylor moved on again, and MGM hired him to run their Verve chapter of their business. And Creed Taylor brings a real change to what Verve was about. First of all, he brings the gatefold jackets, which he of course does so well at Impulse. He brings that same level of design, the shiny shellacked covers with the thick spines, the beautiful packaging that really stands the test of time. You could put most of these on a coffee table and they would be still beautiful pieces of art. He releases some of the vintage era artists from their contracts. He keeps some. Count Basie actually leaves for a while and does a number of records at Roulette, and by number I mean a lot. But he ends up coming back to Verve and making another string of another dozen records at Verve in the 60s. Johnny Hodges seems to stay. He's one of the guys that seem to stay through from one era to the next. And Hodges makes another 12 great records in this era. Oscar Peterson, of course, is a mainstay and stays throughout the whole time. Guys like Jerry Mulligan, Stan Getz, they're forward-thinking enough and modern enough to fit into this new development that's happening at Verve. But Verve decides they need some new talent to represent what's happening in jazz as jazz is changing. To Creed Taylor's mind, the old Verve blueprint of these old swing cats doing these blowing sessions, playing the blues, it wasn't current anymore. And that was his mind. He wanted to make Verve a current enterprise, and he always is kind of trying to shape these labels into his own vision. And Creed Taylor was not a trained musician. He was not even a trained producer, session A&R. He had no training. He walked into Bethlehem pretty much off the streets and convinced Gus Wilde at Bethlehem that he had what it took to do this. And with charisma and guile and a certain amount of luck, Creed Taylor did it. And he ends up being at Verve for a good stretch before he ends up going to A&M and launching CTI, which is where the Creed Taylor story kind of culminates. But his imprint is all over this late era of Verve. It's very omnipresent. And from the gatefolds to this wave of new talent that comes in, to the style and sound of the recordings, this that we're listening to, this is not Norman Graham's Verve. This Latin inflected, loungy salsa, I got a pineapple straw hat on my head. Serve me up a pina colada. That was Creed Taylor's mission statement. Let's make records that white America, with their station wagon and their suburb cul-de-sac sprawling interstate frontage road lifestyle, can put on their table and on their turntable and enjoy and relax and feel hip and have a soiree, but never be reminded too much about the roots of where the music came from. You're not going to get a lot of that Negro experience, that sorrow, that pain, that angry expression of the cats at Blue Note. And I've told you before, those cats at Blue Note in the mid-50s were very anonymous, young kids that no one knew. They've since become legends in our mind's eye, but those Blue Note cats were anonymous, young kids for the most part. And Verve had all that real name talent. And Creed sets a lot of those guys aside and starts bringing in talent from all the other labels that he knows he can reshape in his image without having to tinker too much, without it being too racially charged. And that's where Verve Part 2 fits into your canon, into your collection. The early Verve stuff is there for you to understand these black legends making a living in America in their golden years, being led around the country and the world. Norman Granz and Tour, Philharmonic. That's a different era of Verve. It's a very important documentation of a time. This new era of Verve was cocktail, lounge, relaxing. All the jazz remix projects you see that are about Verve jazz remix, they're remixing this era stuff. They're not really touching that early stuff. this is what they want to remix. Because a lot of those loungy cha-cha-cha sounds are already present in these records. And so these modern DJs, all they had to do was put a modern beat with it, a few subs in there, some low end. Next thing you have a remix you can play at the club today. And you're connected to jazz and Verve, but you're not really connected to jazz in the black sense of expression and improvisation and my soul speaking. You're connecting with jazz in the hip sense, the coolness, and this kind of distillation of what jazz in Creed Taylor's mind could be. And you buy these era of Verve records for a different reason than you buy the early Verve records. You buy the early Verve records to know the greats, to know the legends, to understand and comprehend the lifetimes that these people all gave to this art form. You buy these later Verve records to lounge to hang out with your friends to. As a DJ, you can mix these into your lounge happy hour sets, and they're just kind of swanky, urban chic to them that allows you to sit in the most relaxing of shade lounges, and the lighting is low, the drinks are sweet with umbrellas, the ladies are all dressed fine. Sex in the City is Verve. That whole nightclub scene, that sound, and we're not talking the techno and house. That's after 10 p.m., 11 p.m. We're talking what you hear from happy hour till about 10 p.m. The swank. We haven't opened up the dance room. We're still lounging on the couches. And this stuff is what you buy Verve for from the 60s. It's entertaining music. Music to entertain with, to entertain by. There's some elements of amazing jazz playing and improvisation and composition, but those things all kind of take a back seat here to arrangement and to composition in terms of the production values. Albums will often have a theme. We're going to embody the Far East with some jazziness. We're going to embody India and the middle Southern Asian sounds. We're going to capture the island feel. And it might not be the Liberty, Quiet Village kind of soft, swanky stuff. But the Verve stuff is kind of, a hi-fi label out of jazz, hi-fi jazz out of LA. Does a lot of records about Bahia and Hawaii and these sounds with bongos, and it's not really jazz. It's got elements of jazz. Again, those Quiet Village records on Liberty aren't really jazz. They have elements of jazz. These Verve records still have a lot more jazz and meat to their bones. But again, they're much more meant to play in a margarita lounge. This is perfect for that. You can salt the glass right now. And this, of course, is the great Cal Jader. And I'm going to kind of run through some stuff here really quickly. And I want to also mention where most of these guys are coming from. And how many labels Creed Taylor guts by taking their best-selling artists away from them. Jimmy Joffrey is an important guy to mention here. I kind of finished my part 1 with the Jimmy Joffrey, and I'm going to start my part 2 with the Jimmy Joffrey. This is actually 83-97, and this is as big a harbinger of the change coming. But this is actually quite an avant-garde piece. Modern, hints of modal, hints of real edgy composition. Just a threesome of bass, clarinet, and piano. Fantastic. I know it's Joffrey on the clarinet. I think it's Steve Swallow. I can't remember. I know this, but I can't think of it right now. It's a great little record. Hard to find. It's become quite expensive. But this is not the Norman Granz sounding jazz. This is a different sounding jazz. And it's not a sound that Verve does much of. But it's an important element to recognize the change is coming. This was that Cal Jader record I was talking about. And Cal Jader was at Fantasy Records forever. Out of the Bay Area. He must make 30 records at Fantasy. And I think Creed Taylor targets him right away and says, I can offer you quite a bit more money to come here to Verve. And he must make 15 records in the next 8 years. They're all really good. He's a great player. He's a white guy playing Latin music, but he does it really well. I recommend all Calgina records. They're fun, but you're not going to get that Blue Note gospel of tyranny and our resistance to that tyranny. This is more, how cold is the watermelon? Better be cold. Oscar Peterson, of course, it was a mainstay of Norman Granz's Verve era. His trio backs many of the great Norman Granz led sessions. He sticks around and makes another dozen records in the 60s at Verve. Even the sound and look of these records changes. Again, it's the gatefold packaging. The trio here, Ed Thigpen's now in the group. Herb Ellis is no longer a part. He's not even a guitar player now. This is Ray, Ed, and Oscar Peterson, though, can fill in all the gaps. He's that much of a virtuoso. Somewhat of a difficult person, but super talented. And I think he's a Montreal native. Spent time in Toronto as well, and of course in New York. But these records are all great, and you really can't go wrong with an Oscar Peterson record from any era. This is all 8400 stuff right now. 8432, and that was the bang heard around the jazz world right there. This record launches the Bossa Nova craze in America. And Verve tries to recapture the magic at least 30 times in the next 2 years on the label. Most of it's outstanding in that real Bossa Nova sense. They learned early on that you can't use the wrong musicians to make this music. You need to have the right people to play the feel and the patterns and the groove and to make it touch you where it's supposed to. And this record sold really well and validated Creed Taylor's plan. And MGM had to love these early returns on their signing of Creed Taylor. And of course, Stan Getz has a lot of records early at Verve, spent some time at Roost, comes back to Verve, and he's responsible for some of the great sessions that exist at Verve throughout the 60s. He's a real mainstay. And this is one of those records that you can play at any kind of event, and people are going to be surprisingly comfortable with it. They're going to feel like they know it. And a lot of these tracks have showed up in films and even television shows. It's used to create a certain vibe and atmosphere in film all the time, these Verve Bossa records. And so you don't even know Agua de Beber, but you hear it enough that when you hear it, it's like, it's like some of those Henry Mancini songs. You hear Lujan enough in film, and it's like it becomes comfortable to you. And Getz really kind of takes on a new sound here. It's lighter, it's airier, less intense. He kind of almost brings Paul Desmond to the tenor. Very light, airy. It's very well aerated. It just floats. Fantastic stuff. And so 8420, whatever that was, 8432, and now it's just on. This is Herb Ellis, a great guitar player who played for years with Oscar Peterson and Ray Brown. He makes a couple of records at Verve that are really outstanding. 8452 is the great Billy Strayhorn, Johnny Hodges session, showing you that they're still doing some of the old stuff, but notice it's not a gatefold. It's like the old cats don't get the gatefold. They get to run out their contracts, but there's still enough people buying Oscar. There's still enough people buying Johnny Hodges, so we'll keep them on. But they're not going to be affiliated with this new Verve sound with the gatefold. This is a really cool record. This is Bobby Brookmeyer Orchestra, Gloomy Sunday, and Other Bright Moments. Arranged by Bobby Brookmeyer, Ralph Burns, Al Cohn, Gary Sauter, Gary McFarlane. And some of these names are going to be really important to Verve in the coming years, because there's a lot of great arrangers that get paid by being at Verve and helping Creed Taylor arrange these sessions to have the production values that he wants. Gary McFarlane's a guy that does that a lot. Bobby Brookmeyer does that. 8455, this one's kind of tougher to come by, but it's fantastic stuff. Jimmy Smith. this was the bullet that really killed Blue Note. Losing Jimmy Smith to Verve was just a devastating blow for the Blue Note label. All that creative and fancy music that Blue Note was putting out, Jimmy Smith was the kind of base that kept the sales high enough to allow all the other stuff to happen. And when they lost Jimmy Smith to Verve, I've read there was tears. There was tears. And I don't think Jimmy Smith did it lightly. I don't think it was an easy choice. But the money at Verve, being backed by MGM, was probably, and with the huge national distribution, putting on a much bigger stage versus just the tri-state Northeast area that Blue Note really was having any kind of sprawl into. By 1961, Blue Note's distribution probably had been somewhat better, but it was still in the thousands versus the tens of thousands that a great Verve, or even 100,000 copies that some of these Verve records would sell, and some of these Bossa records sold millions. This is Kai Winding, and Kai is, of course, one of the great trombone players. He has a lot of great records at Columbia with J.J. Johnson. Kai Winding makes records at Savoy. He makes records at Bethlehem. He's kind of in a lot of places. He's a great trombone player. And he's another guy that Creed Taylor brings over and says, I think you'll fit the image I'm looking for. And of course, he's a white guy in a suit. I can sell that anywhere. Terry Gibbs, a fantastic vibist. One of the great vibraphone players that people kind of forget about is Terry Gibbs. He has a great string of records at Emerson. Really hot, potent stuff. And he starts the Dream Band with a great lineup of musicians. But then he comes to Verve, and he makes some really solid records at Verve. Again, it's more that modern, new age sound that Creed Taylor's looking for. He's not interested in hiring all the old cats anymore. And a lot of those old cats end up going to Prestige and making the Swingsville and the Moodsville records. It's pretty interesting how the labels do dictate a lot of this stuff. Shelly Manne, the great West Coast drummer, fantastic player, great arranger. Shelly Manne's a very creative mind. Here with the great Bill Evans and Monty Budwig. Bill Evans, of course, becomes a mainstay at Verve. And hiring Bill Evans away from Riverside guts Riverside. And of course, Riverside's days for this world were numbered by 1962. You know, they were running into bankruptcy. Bill Grauer's about to pass away, leaving Keep News with a whole pile of debt that he didn't even know about. And so Riverside's times were numbered anyway. But losing Bill Evans to Riverside, it just kills. This is Jazz Samba, Bob Bruckemeyer, Bossa Nova, another fantastic Bossa record. The trombone is an amazingly versatile instrument. We're going to move on now to the 8500 sequence. And this is 8508, 1963. Oliver Nelson, Full Nelson. And he makes a lot of records at Verve. He also does a lot of arranging and producing and conducting at Verve. Oliver Nelson, the player, becomes Oliver Nelson, the producer at Verve. Just like Gary McFarlane, just like a lot of the other cats, he's not as much into just sitting back and playing his horn and being happy with that. He wants to now have this broader vision. And he ends up taking that to television and film, if I recall, for a while. Oliver Nelson's a brilliant mind. He comes off some great recordings at Impulse. He makes a lot of great sessions at Prestige as a player, and he does some great playing here at Verve. But again, that's the new sound of Verve. And Full Nelson, music and arranged by Oliver Nelson. This will give you a great indication of what Creed Taylor was looking for. 8511. Again, it's an old cat, no gatefold. Count Basie. I could have showed you any of a number of Count Basie records, but his records here at Verve in the mid to late 60s are just outstanding, and they're really fun. And that's probably the one thing that Count Basie, to his credit, was able to do, was graft pop sensibility. Ray Charles, Beatles, we'll do whatever, but we'll make it swing. I don't care what music you drop in my lap. We're going to chart it, and we're going to kill it. And Basie swings hard always. He just doesn't know how not to. It's like James Brown. You give something to James Brown, he's going to reduce it down to its essential elements. And what you're going to be left with is, good God. And it's simple. A simple pattern. 3 sounds, Gene Harris, Huge string of records at Blue Note. They bring the three sounds over. They only make the one record, but it's a noteworthy piece. You can find that for 10, 15 bucks. Gary McFarland. McFarland also has some stuff at Impulse as well. He's a composer, arranger, a pianist. I think he also plays a horn, if I recall. I can't remember right now. But McFarland's an interesting guy, and his hands are producing and arranging and conducting a lot of sessions at Verve. He's a very important figure from that standpoint. Luis Bonfa came over, another Brazilian Bossa Nova sound, 8522. Great record. This one's actually pretty tough to come by, and I've seen that one climb up to 50, 60 bucks now. Because of that distribution, most of these records won't get over 30 bucks. You know, Bill Evans is one of the exceptions, but as Bill Evans Riversides go for thousands, if not hundreds, Bill Evans Verves go for 50, 60, 80, maybe 100. This is conversations with myself, and it's actually him being multi-tracked, where he's playing and talking with himself, interluding different takes, adding different accompaniments all on the piano. Pretty interesting stuff. Again, it's multi-tracked, so you're not going to have the live sense of improvisation, but it's still Bill Evans, and it's wonderful. Samba Parados, Leila Schiffer, and Bob Bruckemeyer. This is a great record. In fact, my friend Jean-Michel told me that I think Bruckemeyer wasn't even supposed to be on this session. If I remember, it might have been supposed to be Oscar Gilberto, if I remember. But something happened the day of, and they brought Bobby in, and he kills it. It's just a wonderful, melancholy, buzzing of bumblebees, summer breezes, fantastic stuff. It's right in that wheelhouse. 8545 is this landmark album. And anything with this color, pattern, painting on the Verve cover, they're all Bossa, they're all fantastic. Grab them when you see them. They're just awesome records. They are what they are. They're not trying to be something they're not. They're easy listening, accessible, but still with some great playing, some great guitar playing, some wonderful single cymbal piano lines, and a groove that just wants to wash you away. One of my favorite records of all time. I've talked about this record many times. The great Antonio Carlos Jobim. Some of these songs on here are standards, and you really need to know this record to understand a lot of what happens in jazz in the 60s. Even Miles Davis does Dusty Venato and Meditation and Corcovado. These songs show up everywhere. I Get a Bear, Girl from Ipanema, Jazz Samba, and Sensites. All these songs show up everywhere. Sinatra does a record with Jobim. It's just, they're songs that were staples of the Bossa Nova sound, and they even get reinterpreted in non-bossa senses at times. They're just absolutely standards. And like you should know the American Songbook, you should know this songbook to have an understanding of the culture that surrounds Bossa Nova. And you can play that at any cocktail party, and people will thank you. They'll be like, oh, don't know what that is, but that's perfect. And they do kind of know what it is because it's been in so many films that they're familiar with almost every song on the record. It's a stalwart of any event. You can't not have that record. Kenny Burrell, they bring Burrell over, and Burrell's always been a bit of a nighthawk. He kind of moves around from label to label. He's not like a Jimmy Smith where he stays at one place for a long time, but he was at Blue Note, he was at Prestige. He comes to Verve here in probably 1963. Makes 5 or 6 great records at Verve. His guitar form record is really fantastic. 85-55, Gil Evans, not Bill, Gil Evans, who was of course famous for The Birth of the Cool, working with Miles on all those fantastic sketches of Spain, those records that really melded the classical European sound with elements of jazz. You know, they're crossover fusion records. They're not straightforward jazz records, which can be very misleading when you're a young jazz fan. If Sketches of Spain is one of the first 10 jazz records you hear, it's going to really skew what you think the sound of jazz is and can be. But when you hear Sketches of Spain in its right place, you know that it's an abstract of jazz. It's distilled some of the sounds of jazz, but brought some European tradition into it, and it's not a straightforward jazz record in any sense. Gil Evans was popular. Miles Davis, those records sold well at Columbia, and so it made sense for Verve and Creed Taylor to say, hey, Gil Evans, come here to Verve and make some music for us. He also does some producing and arranging and conducting at Verve as well. So the conductors, arrangers, composers, these guys have as big a say in the direction of Verve now, the Oliver Nelsons, Gary McFarland's, as the players do. In fact, the players seem to be relegated somewhat beneath the composers and arrangers, the conductors of sound, the producers of sessions, have a big say and imprint on most of these records. Wynton Kelly, like Jimmy Smith, was somewhat hurt by coming to Verve. Distribution was great, they sold well, probably made a decent paycheck, but his records at Riverside, his records anywhere else were fantastic. VJ, Kelly's records at Verve are okay. One of them has strings, which kind of waters it down. The live record with Wes Montgomery is what you really want to hear from Wynton Kelly, but it's still great stuff, and I love Wynton. It's another one of the great artists that Creed Taylor brought over, though, was Wynton Kelly. 8608, now we're in the 8600s. This is the first Astrid Gilberto record as a leader. She shows up with The Girl from Ipanema, the great Stan Getz record, but she makes probably 7 records as a leader in his later years of the 60s. And again, they're fantastic for sitting around, rubbing suntan lotion on your lady's body. She's not a great singer. You know, I mean, you'd be lying to say, oh, she's one of the greatest singers of all time. She's kind of diminished, effortless but soft. Almost, I won't say she's flat at times, but she has an interesting, unique delivery. And I think sometimes English not being her first language, she has weird rhythmic enunciations of syllables. It's all her own style. They're fun records though, and again, you can play them at events. Donald Byrd, he's an outlier. He's a guy that comes over here who's mostly, obviously, at Blue Note. And I don't even really remember how this got made at Verve. Sorry, there's a very signature sounding boogaloo track on this one. It might be Blind Man. I can't know. It's Cantaloupe Island. That's what it is. He does that on here, and it's a staple. Of course, the Herbie Hancock. The next guy that comes over 8610 in 1964, maybe 65, is Wes Montgomery. And they took him from Riverside as well. And again, it just keeps compiling. This is an outstanding session. Most of Wes Montgomery's Verve stuff is really a giant and a genius trapped doing Christmas songs. It's like he's so talented, he can be doing anything. He's got all these kids and all these mouths to feed, bills to pay. And so he does California Dreaming. He does Tequila. He does a lot of these kind of poppier, light jazz ensemble things. And again, they're fun records to play at an event. I'll play those Wes Montgomery records all day, but they don't have the substance and the feel of what he does at Riverside. Kenny Burrell, I love this record. I've featured it numerous times. It absolutely should be in anyone's collection. Again, it's Gil Evans' work here with Kenny Burrell. And it's interesting to hear Gil Evans, not with Miles. Spain, honestly. Lotus is fantastic. Great record. Another important section by Bill Evans. Trio 64, Trio 65. They're both great records. He's in another new creative period here. And Bill Evans, of all the people at Verve, seems to have been given the most license to do what he wants and still be who he used to be. Jimmy Smith gets changed. Wes Montgomery gets changed. Wynton Kelly gets changed. Bill Evans is still doing Bill Evans stuff without any kind of question. There's a Calgeda record from the 8600s, 8614. Great cover, Soul Sauce. And it just fits in with all that same sound. Grant Green, of course, of Blue Note fame. Grant makes only the one record at Verve, and his contract with Blue Note had expired. He was actually having drug problems, from what I understand. That's why they let him go for a while. He makes this record at Verve. He makes a few other records in other places. Then he gets cleaned up and goes back to Blue Note and continues a great string of releases at Blue Note, more in the funk, jazz vein. Willie Bobo comes along, probably 65, probably 65 here, Spanish Grease. And he makes 5 or 6 records at Verve that are fantastic Latin rock jazz. I mean, it's take 2 parts Santana and 1 part Cal Jader and one part real fantastic Latin beats, grooves. He's a drummer, and these records are all fun. Oh Brother, I can't remember what it's called. Oh Brother Son. It's a great song. I don't think it's on this one, but no, but this is fantastic stuff. And he does a lot of covers of kind of rock, R&B songs, and gives them all this kind of Latin jazz inflection. Again, Bobo records are always fun to play in an event. 8658, Walter Wanderley, the Brazilian organ player, his version of So Nice, Samba, Summer Samba. It would be so nice. Everyone knows that song. This is where it's from. Again, it's a staple of the Verve canon, and you've been hearing So Nice forever. From films to parties, that song's omnipresent. Howard Roberts, the great guitar player, part of the LA Wrecking Crew scene, he makes a lot of great records at Capitol. He's a fantastic guitar player. He knocks this record out here at Verve with woodwinds and strings. So it's kind of, again, a Creed Taylor, Verve amalgamation of hip sound. Let's put the hipness out there. This is a great record by Eddie Thigpen, the drummer, with a really modern lineup with Clark Terry, Ron Carter, Herbie Hancock, Kenny Burrell. Pretty tough to come by. He ends up going to Denmark not long after this and is no longer a part of the American jazz scene for a number of years. Great record. Some pretty modern sounds there. Curtis Amy, he's a really great West Coast sax player. Makes a lot of great records at Pacific Records that are outstanding. They bring him over to make this record. Mustang, fun stuff. Very edible. It's very easy to chew on. Johnny Smith, the fantastic guitar player from Roost. They bring him over, and he makes probably 3 records at Verve in the mid to late 60s before he ends up retiring to take care of his daughter because his wife had passed from an illness. And we lost Johnny Smith as the jazz figure that he was becoming, one of the preeminent guitar players in jazz in the 50s. And by the end of the 60s, he was living in Denver, raising his daughter, and playing a little bit locally, if I remember. But Johnny Smith is one of my favorites. He's a super beautiful player. Roland Kirk, not a name you affiliate with Verve. Again, it shows you the lengths that Verve was willing to go to bring in these new modern sounds. And this doesn't sound quite like Kirk at Prestige or at King, his early work. It's definitely got a little bit more of a center to it, but it's still interesting. Benny Golson, a fantastic sax player. This is a record called Tune In, Turn On, probably 66, maybe 67. Turn on to the hippest commercials of the 60s, Benny Golson. And it's just fun, hipster stuff, played by a guy who's got bebop roots. Another guy, Jerome Richardson, his records at Prestige go for hundreds of dollars, if not thousands of dollars. This record at Verve, because it sold well and had good distribution, you can find for $10. Fantastic multi-instrumentalist, from a flute to a sax to a clarinet. He plays a lot of things, Jerome. His side work, his body of side work, it's as big as Ron Carter's or Paul Chambers. He's on hundreds of great records in the 50s and 60s. You can't go wrong with Jerome Richardson. Wrapping this video up, Gil Mal, who made some great music at Blue Note in the early 50s, some great record at Prestige in the late 50s. Starts working in film and movies, and he makes his one last record for Verve in 1967, 8744. And so you see now, 8744, that's a long ways away from where we started with Charlie Parker at 8,000, and where we started with Ella Fitzgerald at 4,000. There's a lot of records in the Verve canon. George Benson, fantastic Pittsburgh-born blues, soul, jazz giant. One of the most talented, viscous players we've ever heard. Benson was just a brilliant player. He makes a couple of great records at Verve in the late 60s. Milt Jackson, the great vibraphonist, who of course was part of the Modern Jazz Quartet forever, played at Atlantic forever, has a number of records at other labels. He makes some records at Verve in the late 60s that are noteworthy. And the last, Phil Woods. This is 8791. And by now we're probably 1969, maybe even 1970. And Phil, of course, is a kind of a modern composer, modern player. Here he's playing on the back here with Johnny Pate and Charlie Swanson. And you can see the era this is a part of. That looks more like Woodstock era photography than it does Jazz Age. But that's Verve. Verve in these late years is grafting onto what's hip, what's cool, what's modern, what's commercial, what's going to sell. And everybody who comes to Verve has to maintain a certain element of commercial viability. And it's understandable that change happens. And there's no way Norman Granz could have sustained what he was doing at Verve in the 50s throughout the 60s. You know, bankruptcy would have ensued. And what ends up happening is that he ends up moving on to Pablo eventually and bringing a lot of these cats back in their late years and recorded more great music in the 70s at Pablo. So Norman Granz is such a huge legend of the story. Creed Taylor's a huge part of the story in the 60s. Verve is the most important label in a lot of ways. Its body of work is immense. The ground it covers is incredibly varied. Most of it's so worthwhile to listen to. Some of it's essential. It's unlike Blue Note that does one thing. Verve does a lot of things. It does most of them really well. And unlike the Blue Note Prestige, Riverside, Savoy, Bethlehem, all Verve's distribution puts this stuff on a different stage. And it doesn't have quite the budget and the distribution and the commercial restrictions of a Capitol or a Decca or a Columbia. Even though those labels started to become fairly open to various sounds. Verve allows you to have some of what's good about a smaller label with its production and its sensibilities, with the distribution of a bigger label. It's a perfect mid-size. And having said that, Verve is so important because so much of America didn't get Blue Note, Prestige, Savoy, Riverside. So much of America never saw an Argo record. You know, some of these small labels that are smaller than those didn't get around the country. Verve was something anyone, anywhere could buy. Buy their Oscar Peterson, buy their Ella Fitzgerald, buy some Louis Armstrong, and hopefully, they're going to dig a little deeper and find some of the other great legends and classics and move into some of the other smaller labels that are kind of niche in between. So Verve does serve an incredibly important purpose, and you really can't go wrong buying almost anything on Verve. But these are great places to start. These are all important artists. And again, the two chapters need to be served separately. It's like you can't even serve them at the same meal. We were once a Chinese restaurant, now we kind of an Asian restaurant, or a Mexican restaurant. You don't want to mix them. You want to kind of keep them in separate places. But it's part of the story of jazz. So that's what I do. I like to share that story. And the labels tell us a lot of the story. So my name is Dan, I'm the Jazz Shepherd. If you appreciate the channel, go to my Patreon page and throw me $5 a month to help out. It's always appreciated. No obligation, of course. If you want, there's some great Jazz Shepherd merchandise at the merchandise store, which you'll see in the description below. Grab a t-shirt, grab a hoodie. Enjoy your day, enjoy your summer. We'll check in back with you soon. Y'all be safe. Peace.